Hello all, my name is Ben Hartley. I work on energy efficiency and cooling at Sustainable Energy for All. Thank you all very much for joining. We hope that you're doing safe and well wherever you might be in the world, and we greatly appreciate you taking time from your day to join us for this webinar. You flip to the next slide. So today, SE for All is excited to release a first of its kind analysis of the gender-based issues related to access to cooling and some practical steps we can take to begin addressing them. SE for All, we've been working on cooling for about 3 years now, and within that we focus on cooling for all. To us, that means how a lack of access to cooling can threaten your health, your productivity, or the food or vaccines that are making their way from a production site to your table or your arm. We also think about how enhancing access to sustainable cooling can help people achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So cooling is a relatively new issue, but it's gradually being understood as an energy service that's fundamental to achieving SDG 7. That makes it similar to other energy services, like clean cooking, for example. So why did we decide to develop this knowledge brief? Well, we know from experience that there are gender-based factors that affect the ability of women and men to access and benefit from energy services, including electricity for productive use, and clean cooking, as I mentioned. So clean cooking, for example, showed us that women and girls bear the largest health burden, not only from indoor air pollution sources, but often also from issues related to fuel gathering tasks, with access to clean cooking helping to mitigate some of these problems. And so with cooling, we initiated this work because we wanted to understand the gender-based factors related to a lack of access to cooling, potential benefits, and to point to a few recommendations where this research can be tested and more data can be collected. So this is the first such effort that we were aware of, and the process was helpful to confirm some ideas around impacts, but also to tell us where there may not have been gender-based issues. And in doing so, we hope to make a contribution to SDG 5 and gender equality through Cooling for All. So I'll turn it over to the team that developed the knowledge brief in a moment, but I'll run you through the agenda that you can see on screen. So we'll begin with a presentation of the knowledge brief findings from my colleagues Hannah, Eduardo, and Alice. And then we'll move to a question and answer session. And joining us are Aksum Tefera, who's an associate director at the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program at the ClimateWorks Foundation, Susmita Patnaik, who's a gender advisor for water and energy for food at the South and Southeast Asia Regional Innovation Hub, and Nat Akuna, who's a gender specialist at the World Bank's Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, or ESMAP. Before I turn over to Hannah in a second, we'll have a short Q&A. As we go, however, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to either answer them in text as we go through the webinar or during the question and answer session. So with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Hannah. Hannah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you everyone for joining us here today. We are, as Ben mentioned, very excited to be able to present this knowledge brief, and we'll dive right in so we have as much time as possible for discussion later. So as Ben mentioned, we were very eager to examine and really understand the gender-related challenges that should be considered when addressing sustainable cooling for all. I will very quickly, kind of off the top, really mention that we looked at differences in biological sex as well as gender, which is the kind of social and cultural characteristics or norms assigned to women and men when embarking on this research. So we broke this research into 3 categories of challenges we thought might affect access to and benefits from cooling services. Those are health and well-being, poverty and household dynamics, as well as the workplace. Kicking off with health and well-being, right off the bat, we did not find a clear kind of scientific or research consensus around either biological sex or physical attributes, more or less driving men and women's different responses to heat exposure or heat illness. We do know from extensive literature that certain groups, particularly young children, the elderly, ill, and pregnant women, have lower abilities to tolerate heat stress and are increasingly vulnerable as the impacts of climate change drive increases in extreme temperatures. But what was clear from the research we did is that the gendered nature of women's household responsibilities puts them at elevated risk for heat stress during extreme temperature events or heat waves. And in a study of the 2010 heat wave that hit Ahmedabad in India, women were found to suffer disproportionately due to their proximity to outdoor fires for cooking, lack of access to fans in poorer homes, or the heat trapping clothing they wore while conducting intensive work as manual laborers. And outside of the kind of physical response to extreme heat, high temperatures also impact women who already face burdens in accessing reliable healthcare or those who struggle to provide nutritious diets for their children. In a healthcare setting, SE for All has highlighted the large number of clinics and care facilities that lack access to electricity or grapple with unreliable sources of energy. And as COVID-19 and other diseases and viruses before it have so clearly exposed, this lack of reliable medical cold chains in a majority of regions and rural areas impacts the distribution of life-saving vaccines. Related to health outcomes, the ownership of a refrigerator has been linked to safer food preparation within households and led to better nutrition for young children in these families. As women are often the primary preparers of food, access to enhanced cooling for food storage can have incredibly meaningful impacts on their time, the financial resources of the family, as well as health. Next slide, please. So looking ahead for this category of challenges we examined, we identified a handful of recommendations that could help us better understand health and well-being impacts of cooling access. We need gender responsive education and communication efforts before and during extreme heat events. We must have a better understanding through comprehensive and sex disaggregated data collection of the gendered impacts of heat exposure. We must also prioritize vaccine distribution in a way that doesn't further exacerbate gender and economic disparities for women and children. And finally, it's critical to invest in women's access to refrigeration technology as a driver for household level nutrition and health improvements. Next slide, please. So moving on to our second category, we know that poverty dramatically exacerbates the risks and impacts of heat stress for women and men. As documented in Chilling Prospects last year, over 300 million people live in poor rural settings at high risk of a lack of access to cooling, as well as cold chains that would enable them to sell their agricultural products further afield. Climate change impacts are felt today as temperatures rise and extreme weather threatens food security and livelihoods. And for women, the ability to be resilient and adaptive in this setting is much harder, as they comprise less of 15% of landowners globally and have difficulties accessing credit or financing for cooling solutions, such as shading in fields or refrigeration to chill their crops before sale. For the nearly 700 million urban poor, their cooling challenges can present as crowded housing with poor insulation for warmer temperatures. Many families are also unable to afford efficient and/or high-quality products, such as fans, air conditioners, to protect from increasingly pronounced urban heat islands. For the young, the elderly, pregnant, ill, as well as seasonal migrant workers and those living without homes, these conditions add a further layer to the heat stress vulnerability exacerbated by poverty. And diving further into the household, we examined how the often gendered nature of chores, indoor and outdoor chores, impacts women who spend more time in the home and frequently in the hottest rooms. Open fires or biomass stoves for cooking are widely used by billions to this day, and often placed inside kitchens with poor ventilation to disperse heat and indoor pollution. Additionally, cultural norms continue to impact household decision-making for those who can afford to purchase cooling appliances such as a fan or an air conditioning unit. And while decision-making dynamics have been studied in many other areas, the growing affordability and then the growing necessity of some of these appliances as temperatures rise really highlights a need for a much better understanding of gender preferences and decision-making power within households. Next slide, please. So to tackle some of these challenges we touched on in this category, we encourage policymakers and project implementers to apply a gender-based analysis to all cooling initiatives. Data is again needed to drive understanding of the complex dynamics that lead to unequal access to services due to gender and poverty. We also suggest increased investment in sustainable cooling solutions that target women as decision makers as well as beneficiaries. To further tip gender inequality and women's leadership disparities. We also advocate for financing women-driven solutions and business models in this space. We'll turn the presentation over to my colleague Alice to take us further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I will now present you the key findings regarding the challenges faced by men and women in the workplace. And we will start first by the agriculture and fishing sector. So we know that agriculture is the most important source of employment for women. On the graph to the right-hand side, you can see that the female share of economical active in agriculture. We see here that about 50% of women in sub-Saharan Africa are economically active in agriculture. This number goes to about 42% for the Asia region, and it goes down to about 20% for the Latin America and the Caribbean region. Compared to the global number seen at the end, the last bar, which is 42%, we really do see the importance of agriculture as a source for employment for women. In fisheries, women tend to be involved in post-harvest activities. Usually they are involved in a segment where quality losses often occur due to lack of access to refrigeration, resulting in lower income for traders and retailers. A key barrier to accessing cold chain for agriculture and fisheries faced by women specifically is access to finance. This barrier usually impacts affordability of efficient and advanced equipment or technological innovations. So all in all, we know that gender equality in the agriculture sector really needs to be addressed. This by implementing labor standards, including measures for informal workers. We'll shortly get to that. But these measures need to be implemented in rural areas, for rural infrastructures, for regulation. There also needs to be a regulation of natural resource management and promotion of gender equality. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now let's go to the informal and formal employments. So here we know that women working in informal settings such as outdoor street vending, domestic work, and subsistence farming are at increased risk of heat stress on the job. Informal settings are often more vulnerable workplaces for women, with a higher chance for dehydration and increased susceptibility to heat illness, especially during the high temperature days. Looking quickly on the little vignettes for some of the data here. So we found that 95% of women in informal, 95% of people in informal employment are women, especially in the South Asia region. And this number goes to 89% in sub-Saharan Africa, while it goes down to 59% in the Latin America and the Caribbean region. So here, women's incredibly high representation in informal sector demand consideration and inclusive planning to diminish workplace quality gaps. Let's go now to the formal employments. Within formal employment settings, women and men both face potentially dangerous exposure to heat and the impacts of heat stress in certain industries. Here we know that an estimated 80% of women make up the labor force of the textile, garment, and footwear industry. And this textile industry is found mostly, about 75% of the industry is based in the increasingly warm Asia Pacific region. For men, they comprise of 90% of the construction and extraction workforce. Workers specialized in roofing and road constructions have been shown to be about 13 times more likely to die from illness related to heat stress. Here we can see that heat is one factor of workplace safety, but its conditions result in lower levels of productivity, serious illness, and increased vulnerability for working women and men, thus increasing gender cooling gaps. Next slide, please. So some of the recommendation to ensure safe and decent work through access to sustainable cooling. We need to expand and enforce workplace protections particularly for women-dominated occupations and sectors employing vulnerable populations, such as migrant workers. We also need to increase investment in off-grid, solar-powered cold storage systems to reduce food waste and make more food available for subsistence and sales, thus ensuring food security and economic development while minimizing the adverse effects of conventional fossil fuel-based agricultural value chains. We also need to increase investment in sustainable cooling solutions that support both formal and informal workforces. I will now open the floor to my colleague, Eduarda, who's going to be presenting some of the key case studies from the brief. Eduarda?
Thank you so much, Alice, and for everyone joining us here today. So the recommendations mentioned were some of the conclusions we had after deep diving our research in countries with cooling gaps. So starting off with agriculture, cooling is essential to support women's needs as they represent a large percentage of workers in the sector worldwide. So for example, in Mozambique, 60% of women are in the agricultural workforce, which is critical to the GDP and in a country where they are often the heads of households. They have more access to land rights than most countries in the region and are responsible for providing for their families and managing crop production. Similarly, in Nigeria, women do most of their paid work in agriculture, in the country with the largest population of rural poor without access to cooling and electricity. In Sudan, women are also a large majority of the agricultural workforce, where it is estimated that losses in the sector reach $52 per capita annually due to heat stress. So in all these cases, we found that programs targeting financial inclusion of women farmers is key to household and agricultural decision-making to improve productivity, irrigation, and cooling needs. In Pakistan, women are often responsible for food production and crop sales, spending a lot of their time outdoors, exposed to heat stress and diseases. For them, refrigeration is extremely important to reduce food waste and maximize earnings. So we believe that cooling campaigns are important to support better use of their time and raise awareness to health conditions caused by heat exposure. Next slide, please. In terms of labor regulation, we assess the cooling needs of women working as housekeepers in Brazil and India and the garment industry workers of Bangladesh. So Brazil and India have the highest slum dweller populations facing cooling risks and buying least efficient appliances. Both experience heat waves and have the highest numbers of housekeepers in the world. In Brazil, although there is a labor legislation for domestic workers, only 28% of them have work permits. Many women work informally without knowing their rights. There are also no requirements related to environment conditions they work in, which rarely have ventilation or cooling, after they spend hours commuting in public transportation that also doesn't offer cooling. In India, Delhi has one of the worst air pollution levels in the world, and domestic work is the second largest employment sector for women. Currently, they are discussing a national policy for domestic workers, hence the importance of considering minimum standards for indoor heat pollution to protect these women while they're working. In Bangladesh, in the garment industry, this is the sector responsible for 10% of the country's GDP, while employing a majority of women. Working in factories often entails long hours, exposure to machinery heat, and poor ventilation that causes health problems and lowers productivity. Low-cost cooling solutions requirements are crucial additions to new labor regulations, such as adding efficient lighting, installing AC, ventilation, and etc. So moving to the final case study, next slide, please. So we have observed that there is an increasing number of women in the cooling workforce, as it was seen in China, the world's biggest producer of air conditioners. They are seeing higher numbers of women working in this industry as engineers, technicians, and researchers. The same work opportunities could also be present in countries like Indonesia, as it is expected that by 2040, they will account for half of all the AC demand in Southeast Asia. So with a growing middle class and increased electricity access, this could be a new area of work for women in the region and in the world. Although there is limited data linking cooling and gender, we observed in these countries the importance of considering cooling solutions in agriculture and labor policies, as well as a growing new sector where women can play a greater role by entering the energy workforce through the cooling front. I will now pass it over to Alice, who will cover the data collection aspects of our work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Oh, sorry, Eduardo. So let's jump into the call to actions. And I will first focus, as Eduardo mentioned, let's first focus on data collection. So we need to expand data collection to cover indicators such as vulnerability and poverty, cooling, technology and service purchases and use, as well as women healthcare and cooling, and in addition to women in the workplace, covering obviously informal and formal sector. Some of the key indicators that we have identified in the brief are data, sex disaggregated data on poverty in rural and urban settings, intra-household decision-making power to purchase cooling appliances and service, or women representations in energy industry and cooling workforce. So these are really some of the key sectors that we have identified that we feel that would really benefit for a more strengthened data collection. So on the next slide, we're going to go through the key recommendation, and I will here just summarize them in respect of time. So as I mentioned, key recommendation when it comes to evidence, we need to better understand gender differences and impact through data. But also we need policy supporting workplace safety, community heat planning, and personal comfort. Next slide. We also need investments and really to be able to finance gender transformative solutions. And in terms of communication, we need to support attention and awareness raising. And here, just to go a little bit more into details, we would encourage everyone to use the hashtag #ThisIsCool to share information on sustainable cooling solutions, as well as support education of heat adaptability and communicate information to prevent impacts of extreme heat. I will open the floor again and give the floor to my colleague Hannah, who will be starting the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alice and Eduarda, and also to the entire team that supported the creation of this brief, including Ben, Brian, Shayla, Annette, Miriam, Stephen, Andrea, and Isabel today. We're now going to transition into a short panel discussion, so please feel free to start sharing your questions for our team as well as our panelists in the Q&A function as we go along. I'll introduce our panelists briefly again ahead of our conversation. We are joined today by Aksum Tefera, who is the Associate Director of the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, Sasmita Patnaik, who is the Gender Advisor for the Water and Energy for Food, the South and Southeast Asia Regional Innovation Hub, as well as Nat Akuna, Gender Specialist at SMAP. I think we will go ahead and kind of stick with this order we have and begin with Aksum. If you don't mind sharing your video. Okay, fantastic. Aksum, since KSEP has been a leader in promoting clean, climate-friendly cooling in support of the Sustainable Development Goals, we would really love to hear your reflections on this content that's in this brief and how you see gender and cooling, how the gender and cooling nexus adds value and how philanthropy would approach its role in delivering this through Sustainable Cooling for All goals. It's a lot of questions.
Absolutely. And first of all, I do want to thank you and your colleagues for leading on and sharing this important research and really underscoring how important it is that we link gender and cooling to make sure we're working towards creating a more just, sustainable future for all. So I'll speak on behalf of KSEP, the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, and we're a philanthropic collaborative that's been focused on scaling ultra-efficient cooling appliances, passive cooling solutions, and low global warming potential refrigerants. Since we launched a few years ago, we've really focused broadly on raising the profile of cooling as a development and climate priority. And this included supporting efforts to demonstrate the need for cooling access around many parts of the world, and to now funding more delivery of solutions on the ground. SC4L's report helps to deepen philanthropy's understanding of cooling access issues and will inform intervention designs that can scale sustainable cooling while also closing the access gap for girls, women, and other marginalized and underserved people. We're also learning from our current grantees. For example, a sub-grantee of ours from the Ashton Fair Cooling Fund cohort, Sea Balance in India, is working to pilot a women-led cooling business that aims to better understand the cooling needs of women in informal housing and make retrofits where they reside. So I'd say there's a lot philanthropy can learn and apply from research and on-the-ground activity at this intersection of gender and cooling. And climate foundations are well positioned to make decisions and invest resources in ways that can really prioritize gender-centered strategies while also curbing greenhouse gas emissions at the same time.
Thank you so much, Axum. Really appreciate your perspective from the philanthropic side of things. Yeah, I think from your role, is there, do you have a sense of how might the cooling community kind of promote these projects on a large scale? We're really kicking off a conversation today, but any additional thoughts on kind of what comes next from this community?
Yeah, and I'd say, I'll speak broadly of the cooling community, but also philanthropy within that community as well. To begin, I think we should all be focusing on wide-scale integration of equity goals within our cooling strategies, and whether that's in cooling plans, policies, our finance models, or industry engagement, it must really be key. And gender is, of course, an integral part of that. But we must also not forget that there is intersectionality with gender and other factors like ethnicity, race, caste, or other identities that can further marginalize girls and women. And this can, of course, can vary depending on geographical context. But it's essential that we keep many of these elements in mind as we pursue a future with efficient, climate-friendly cooling for all. And then coming at it from the philanthropy side, I'd say we can influence or encourage gender-responsive project design in a number of ways that send a much-needed signal to the field. For example, philanthropy can set clear expectations that gender analysis be done on grant-funded cooling projects and embed that into RFP and reporting requirements, and hopefully that can cascade to scale. Additionally, funders of cooling action plans and policies, whether at national or local levels, can influence the inclusion of gender-centered action. And that could look like getting governments to more explicitly bridge labor and cooling by prioritizing a distribution of climate-friendly cooling solutions to women-dominant industries, as you all have indicated. And that could focus specifically in informal sectors or textile factories or domestic work. I also see an opportunity to put pressure on the cooling industry to do a better job in hiring and retaining women in the workforce. And that could look like elevating companies that are women-led or prioritizing businesses that have targets to increase the number of women hired and demonstrating progress towards those goals. So overall, I'd say really we must take a multi-pronged approach, whether it's philanthropy or the broader cooling community, to advance gender issues within cooling. And we should make sure to act with urgency to improve the lives of those who are most at risk from current heat threats, while simultaneously ramping up our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the sector.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your thoughts here. I know it's a lot to tackle in small sentences. We are talking about some very large challenges, but really appreciate you joining us to share that today.
Thank you.
For now, I think we'll move on to Sasmita for a couple questions. Sasmita, we've touched on this a bit here today, and then further in the brief itself, which was published this morning online. I'm sure we have put the link in the chat, or will do so. But as South and Southeast Asia, apologies, have growing urban populations at risk of impacts to rising temperatures due to climate change. I'm curious to hear how you see this preliminary research as useful to applying a gender lens to sectoral programs and projects in the region, or generally. we'll start there for now.
Thanks for the question, Hannah, and congratulations to the team for putting out a brief which is not just timely, but also very essential to the conversation on cooling, energy access, and climate change mitigation, adaptation, and gender. To answer your question, the research that you've put out there and similar work has the potential to trigger a conversation to begin with, because in many cases, many projects or programs during the conceptualization do not realize that you need a more targeted and integrated focus to address specific equity-based challenges, whether it's gender or other kinds of inequities. And what this will do is help us bring that lens into the work. And that's important because if you look at the data, the OECD aid data, only 10% of projects in the energy sector have a gender lens, or 10% of the aid that goes into energy sector has a gender lens. Whereas if you look at sectors like agriculture, it's about 60%. So when you're looking at an intersection of energy access in agriculture, you are also opening up that potential of bringing in a gender lens into the programs of cooling for agricultural needs. Similarly, other intersections between sectors that we look at. So definitely just introducing the idea of adding a gender lens at the conceptualization of the program and the project, and then budgeting for resources and expertise and capacity within the project. So it's not just important to acknowledge it, but also what is the kind of money you're putting in to make that happen? Is there like resources within the team or capacity within the team to be able to bring that expertise into the discussion? And thirdly, using data or creating that funding or that space for information and data to be collected, to be evaluated and demonstrated, because then that will give pathways and roadmaps for other programs and other projects to be able to emulate these strategies. So I would say these three ways can be looked at as important to look at sectoral programs and integrating this lens there.
Thank you so much. I think the budgeting topic is a fantastic one. As we've kind of learned throughout the process of this research and hopefully shown a bit in the brief, it's a complicated question that takes time and resources.
You need money to do things. Yeah, you need money to do things.
Exactly. Maybe from your perspective and expertise, do you have thoughts on what else might be needed to mainstream this gender lens in other sectors that energy touches on, such as agriculture, water, access, etc.?
Beyond the points that I mentioned, a couple of other things that come to mind is representation on both sides, not just the access side of things, but also like who's designing these solutions, who's in these decision-making positions, whether it's in programs or policies. So it's not to say that role of women in these bodies is only to focus on inequities of gender, but lack of representation on one side is going to, in some ways, result in inequities on the other. So how do you bring that lens also in the decision-making bodies and how you design policies, how you create committees that take these decisions. And in these cases, I think targets really help. Like, how do you institutionalize these targets? Like, you cannot have like a committee with less than 40% women, or other kinds of intersectionalities that Axel was talking about. How do you integrate that into the targeting and the process itself? And these processes will lend itself to better outcomes. Yeah, in addition to that, definitely looking at targets, looking at the decision-making and supply side of things. Yeah, and more importantly, targeting every program for a specific group. Like, not everything might be relevant to everyone, but taking that conscious decision that in this project, we are going to look at the intersection of, say, caste and gender, or in this, we are going to look at disability and gender. So bringing those intersectionalities and designing the project there in that manner, and not making it just one person's responsibility, like making it a team's responsibility where you have accountability at the team level, where everybody in their respective functions is able to bring that equity lens. So if I'm an investment person, am I looking at investment from a gender lens investing perspective? If I'm a program person who's looking at, say, trainings, am I looking at trainings from a gender lens or equity perspective? So how do you build that capacity across all functions would be the other thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's so much here. I think we could talk for hours about this because it is such a big topic. I think your points on targeting for specific groups are really well noted, that women are not a monolithic block. You have so many different lived experiences and needs and challenges that, I think this being a knowledge brief, it's a first step, but we would really like to see a lot more done in terms of research and understanding for more specified groups.
Yeah, and just
go ahead, please.
Sorry, just to close the thought, I think when we also talk about data, we often talk about gender or sex disaggregated data, which is probably the first step. But beyond that, we should start looking at data for analyzing gender relations, how a specific intervention has impact on women. And for that, it may not be enough to have just disaggregated data. You might have to go and do more in-depth research. So also finding the money, the interest, and the capacity to be able to do those studies will definitely inform the sector a lot more, and especially at these intersections of sectors, the way this brief has done. You need many more of these coming out and giving out very tangible strategies, because I think companies or policymakers, they are very willing to work on this in many cases, but if we give them very tangible strategies of how it can fit into their existing work, I think it becomes much more easier to implement it than theoretically saying that this is important and we need to do this. So yeah, and therefore you need that capacity and that expertise on a regular basis.
Absolutely, absolutely. I don't know if you can tell, I'm taking notes. There's a lot to incorporate into our next steps. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.
I think your points on data perfectly segue into our final panelist, Nat Nathieli from SMAP, who is deep in kind of thinking about gender mainstreaming and how gender-informed projects can improve economic and development outcomes within the energy sector. So Nat, we'd love to hear from you on how you see cooling as a sector that can support the economic empowerment and leadership of women kind of through this energy lens that you look at.
Thank you, Hannah, and I'm very excited about this work. I think it's super relevant, especially in COVID times, and that cold chains and all that, which I think is like one of the things that I would like to mention here. But I mean, one of the things that I feel that we give for a given, and especially regarding that complexity, how complex this reality is, like attaching different type of sectors and realities of women and intersectionalities of women and everything. I mean, most of us, we grew up with a fridge, and we don't think that is an asset of, like, producing something. And in that sense, I feel like if we provide energy access and the right tools, such as like a fridge that is very simple, I mean, we can propel different type of activities for women in the economic sector. I also feel like if we don't provide the right tools for different sectors, which are like aligned with this whole thing in regards of like addressing climate change issues and in addressing inequalities as well, such as like health and education and technologies even. I mean, we cannot actually foster the participation of women in the sector as an economic factor. In that sense, for instance, what I was thinking is one of the things is technology. Technology needs certain temperatures for it to perform well. And if women don't have the right tools to have like their equipment in certain temperatures, those equipment are not going to work and they are going to be less productive. And I think because of like, there's like a lot of like there's like an umbrella and of different things that are going to be under specific issues regarding economic empowerment. This is one of the things that is actually, you start thinking about how innovative you could be. So I think we need to take a look on intersectionalities of women in that sense. I mean, who is having the right access to the right technology? What does that mean? As I said, could be a fridge, it could be like, I don't know, AC, it could be something else. And also to include these women in different supply chains. I think that allow them to have a decent job. That could be informal or formal, it doesn't really matter. But I mean, you know, a decent job that at the end of the day is helping them to provide or to support their families and communities. And also that I think it is really important, as I mentioned, because this is really complex and it's also linking with different sectors, is access to water. How are we addressing, as you mentioned clearly, addressing climate change issues? And also, how are we like leveraging women when they're not having the right tools to access the right technology? I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And really appreciate your note on decent work. I think this year has been particularly illuminating in a not great way of the challenges that women face in accessing decent work and you know, continuing that during pandemics and making sure safety is a priority. Maybe as our last question for you, and then we'll move into the kind of more broader Q&A. We have noted in the brief that there's a large number of data gaps that need to be addressed, and wondered if you could speak to the kind of urgent need for more understanding around energy and energy services and how they impact women and men.
Thank you. Yes, I feel like us in these sectors specifically, we are like working a lot in that, in what is happening, right? We are addressing and we're trying to gather data with a gender lens when we know most of the surveys and data gatherings are gender blind. So we are trying to assess and understand what are those differences between men and women in regards to like the status quo, right? Where they are and what are we seeing, what are the right solutions for us to tackle those specific issues. However, I feel that what is happening afterwards, after the implementation of those actions, it's pretty hard for us to gather those results. And what are the real difference between men and women? That is something that, I mean, for implementators in general, I mean, it's really hard for them because they are like working in different type of details, spending the right budget, hiring the right people, etc. So sometimes when it comes to implementation, they know they're working in the actions, but how they're capturing those results is really hard. And I feel like us in these institutions, we have like this is I don't know, like a mandate that we need to keep working in those specific actions and implementation and capturing those results for us to be better and for us to replicate and start working a little bit more much in focusing initiatives that actually we know that really work. Because, you know, at the end, what we're doing is like we're adapting things that we think they work based on the results that probably are pilots interventions and all that they're in a given context, they work. But I mean, we need to understand much better in that bigger context with all this complex and all these sectors like attaining different type of initiatives. I think in that sense, I mean, when we're capturing data, is not only for the sake of data, it's also what are we doing with that data? And what does that mean? And how we are like informing governments, how we're informing our projects, how are we investing our money at the end? That is money from all around the world, of course. But my final point here is like, is not only understanding what is the gap, but how we're using that data specifically for the implementation and how we're capturing results. And that those results themselves are also data that we can use and, you know, like start like moving the ball a little bit and make things that are bigger and better. Thank you.
There we go. Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think a reminder of you know, this is not knowledge for knowledge's sake. We're really working against a fairly secure timeline here in terms of sustainable access to cooling, how efficient those appliances are, what that means for our climate goals, and you know, the ever critical goal of achieving gender equality to yeah, improve lived experiences of the world, to put it very bluntly. So thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And I think we're definitely capturing a lot of ideas of how we can take this knowledge further, and who to work with most urgently to make sure that we're calling for the right things with people who can implement and start to gather some data. I think we have just about 12 minutes left. So thank you all. I know lots of questions are coming in from the Q&A, but just want to give a quick and special thank you to our panelists for joining us for this brief space here. If everyone else wants to turn on their videos, I just have a couple questions to direct around. I think, Alice, we will start with you, if you don't mind. We had a question come through, and apologies, I might be kind of mixing some of them together here. But many of the barriers to access to cooling that women face as individuals and also as workers in particular industries are quite similar to those of kind of other broader workforce challenges. So how can climate interventions in this sector, in the cooling sector specifically, contribute to and improve gender responsive access to cooling broadly?
No, thanks for the question. So I would say that climate change interventions and in particular adaptation have a number of lessons that can be learned, and in particular with respect to integrating equity. Part of the issue is data, which would enable us to understand the challenge, as many of the speakers have also mentioned. But I think also another opportunity would be in maintenance and training, where women can gain access to capacity building programs. Just maybe to, I'm sure maybe other panelists as well and presenters could add to this, but maybe to add at the end that, as we could see, certain industry and sectors are very gendered. I mean, depending on the country and the region and the sector, obviously, where women are very overrepresented. So I think from my kind of thoughts going through the brief as well and editing it was, I think the more affordable energy efficiency technology, especially cooling technology, would be available on the market. This would be, and now thinking specifically on the agriculture sector or industry, the more affordable and energy efficient appliances that we'll be able to have on the market, the more basically women will be able to benefit from that. So I think, yeah, that is what I could answer to that. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks, Alice. Eduarda, did you want to share some thoughts also?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to what Alice said. Just in terms of climate interventions, I think it's very important to think about not just the role of the federal government, but also cities. So, for example, when we were talking about Pakistan and the fact that women are constantly exposed to heat when they're selling the things that they're producing, so small things that local governments could potentially implement would be thinking about greener spaces, and are these places where women are selling things in markets, are they close to a shade? Do they have reflective roofs, or is the painting in the streets white? So I think that there are some cooling interventions linked to climate change that are very low cost and could be easily implemented locally. And also thinking about the case of Brazil and many other countries where, housekeepers have to spend up to 4 hours commuting inside of buses in cities that are extremely warm. So thinking of how buses or other forms of public transportation could also have ventilation and air conditioners, which seems to be something very, hard to implement, but in the end, these small changes can really contribute to the health of not just women, but the populations who are already vulnerable, living far away from city centers, and that could, I think, benefit from these. Yeah.
Thank you both. I think, we're talking about a lot of different types of challenges, and it's a tangled knot of opportunities to address a lot of them at the same time too. So appreciate your thoughts. I would like to open it up to any of our panelists too, if you want to weigh in. I think just directing questions for time's sake, but please feel free to offer your thoughts as well.
I do think that this intersectionality of different sectors is like, what is the complex part? We know in energy sector what is working for energy, but perhaps we don't know what is working for transport. So it is very good that for us to start like start these conversations with stakeholders that actually are working in the same goal at the end, where we're looking is for reduction of poverty, increasing development, and improving people's lives. So if we don't have the right tools or we don't have the right skills to reach out to these sectors, it is very important to start having that discussion such as this, so they can start learning from us and us learning from them. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nat. If Ben is also here, we have two questions that I'll kind of combine if you have a moment, and also open to the rest of the panel. We had a participant ask about how we define sustainable cooling, and I think we kind of dove in with this lens of coming from SC for All's side and having worked on this for a number of years. But how does SC for All and the team interpret sustainable cooling? And then also, how do we make sure that adding these appliances in homes doesn't contribute to increasing temperatures and the urban heat island in cities as well?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's one that we've wrestled with ourselves, and like access to cooling, which exists on a spectrum, solutions also exist on the spectrum and have been labeled green, clean, efficient, climate friendly. There's a number of ways of thinking about it. We have done a bit of work on this at SC for All, and last year put up a chapter in our Chilling Prospects report on getting towards a definition of sustainable solutions that incorporate both an understanding of need, so what are you trying to address, as well as solutions pillars and approaches. So approaches being, what do you want to do? Do you want to protect, reduce the need for cooling, improve the efficiency? Is it through an active technology? Is it through a passive technology? And so I will link to that in the chat in response to that in just a moment, but I would sort of use that to address the second question as well. Because a lot of our work is looking at how do we reduce the need for cooling, not simply through appliances, but through techniques, through services, through policies, and through things like passive cooling. We're seeing very interesting data from another KSIP grantee, Million Cool Roofs Challenge, that is showing the power of painting roofs with reflective surfaces. Can be a difference of a temperature or two, but that can make an enormous amount of a difference in a heat wave, and it can reduce the energy that's necessary to cool a home ultimately. So that only not frees up space for grids, it helps ensure that we can deliver more sustainable energy into those grids. And when we sort of push those solutions out as far as we can and reduce the need for cooling across human comfort and safety, agriculture, and health, we can, I guess, combine that effect and really sort of support climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, and access to sustainable cooling. So hopefully that answers the question. I'll link to the chapter in the chat right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, I would encourage everyone to take a look at the Sustainable Cooling for All's team's work. They've done quite a bit of research and advocacy around this in the past years. There's lots to consider. With the, I think, let's say 3 minutes we have left before closing, I would love to pose a question each to Sasmita and Axum. So maybe 1 minute if you can answer these. Axum, is KSIP directly supporting private sector lead initiatives to scale cooling technologies that accelerates women's access to cooling, or do you focus mostly on public cooling plans?
We do a mix of investment across sectors, public, private, nonprofit, and we think it's really important to continue to do that. And with the private sector in particular, what we do is we've worked with partners to really raise the ambition of manufacturers of cooling. on primarily efficiency standards, what refrigerants they're using, since many in use right now are thousands of times more potent than carbon dioxide. But I think we're all seeing a movement towards expecting that companies are also setting goals around social equity, right? So I think there's a way for us to pair these ambitions and expectations on businesses on the sustainable cooling side as well as the social impact side. And we also support new innovative businesses that are trying to create new finance business models to make things more accessible to marginalized people and girls and women, including that. And so I think there's both sides of it. How do we make sure that our grantees within industry, small companies, are helping access for women, but also hiring and doing more on the workforce side too? Try to capture that in a succinct way, but could go into more detail.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we'll probably go over a couple of minutes, so hopefully folks can stay with us as well. Sasmita, we would be interested in hearing more about best practices that you might have observed at this intersection of energy access and gender, maybe with a particular eye towards kind of project measurement and key performance indicators.
So I can give a few examples of institutions who are probably doing a lot of work on this and have put out, like, say, toolkits or different frameworks to be adapted for each of the sectors. So organizations like, am I audible? I think.
You are, but it's cutting out a tiny bit and we lost your video.
Yeah, because I think there's some internet issue, which is why the video just shut down. But I just stopped, yeah. You have organizations like the CEDA, USAID, BMGF, and within the energy space, Efficiency for Coalition, SE for All themselves, who have worked on gender in different ways and have toolkits, Energia included, where these frameworks can be taken and adapted to different sectors and different needs. You have indicators, you have frameworks, and it will depend on what you want to measure. So you therefore need somebody to be able to translate it for that particular project or that particular sector. And I think what really helps in terms of best practice, like a broad rule that I seem to have found useful, is when you think about gender or any kind of inequity, don't stop at the conventional units of, say, a household or an organization. Go into that. And when you move from a technology-centric model to a user-centric model, where you're looking at who is using that energy and how within a household there are disparities, within an organization or an institution that we see there are disparities in the value chain itself, and map those activities, a lot of these indicators just stand out. Like if you're thinking about access to cooling within a household and you start focusing on the elderly versus women versus men, you will see those patterns emerging. So I think it's also about pushing our boundaries and going beyond the conventional units of development in the energy space that we have thought about so far, like household and larger, broader units, because your inequities and power dynamics happens within these institutions. So how do you kind of use the frameworks to be able to screen for that and then translate it into frameworks for implementation and research? Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think that ties back to yours and others' earlier points, that these projects can also serve as kind of data collection if we're asking the right questions and writing the right indicators as we go along. I think we should pause here. I want to thank everyone so much for your time this morning and this evening as we really kind of start to embark on what's a very exciting opportunity to address gender equality as we tackle sustainable cooling access, kind of in light of the Sustainable Development Goals as well as our broader climate goals. So hope this is the first of many, many conversations to come. With that, I will happily turn it over to Ben to offer some last remarks for us today.
Yeah, thanks so much. I just be very brief. I just wanted to take a quick moment to acknowledge the funders of this work, the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, as well as the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, or the SDC. We are happy to have had the good collaboration or close collaboration with the Cool Coalition on this hashtag This Is Cool webinar. So I'd encourage you to check out the hashtag on Twitter and other social media. Again, it is This Is Cool. And coming up on April 15th will be the next This Is Cool webinar on renewable cooling solutions, which you may be interested in as well. So with that, again, thank you to Hannah, Alice, Eduarda, and the whole team, our speakers today. Very much appreciate you taking the time, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much.